welcome back! We're continuing our study today of Paradiso, and today I'm talking about Canto 7. And really, I ran out of filming time in the last video, and so this should have been part of the last video, but I'm going to go ahead and make a short interlude video between the section of Mercury and the section of Venus. So we're still on Mercury, and we've just finished talking to Justinian, and that section was a particularly famous part of Paradiso. But before we conclude and move on to Venus, we have to hear Beatrice's commentary on what Justinian said. Remember in the last section how I talked about Dante as Beatrice's scribe? So Beatrice is the speaker of the poem. She's the true author, and Dante is merely the inspired poet. And here again, we see Beatrice giving commentary on the poem herself, which mirrors that idea. Canto 7 begins with Justinian's final words, which make Justinian's speech the longest speech in the entire Divine Comedy. It took up all the last canto, plus the beginning of this canto. And he says something that is in both Latin and Hebrew at the same time. Hosanna sanctus Dios Sabaoth, super illianas tranus, claritet tua felices ignes horum malakoth. Also, it's interesting to notice that this is an example of glossolalia, where a person speaks in another language, or speaking in tongues. In the Bible, this was associated with spiritual power, and was also often connected with prophecy and other powerful spiritual acts. This glossolalia also parallels a passage in Inferno, where Plutus speaks in praise of Satan. His words are untranslatable, being some sort of demonic or pseudo-language. And Plutus's words become something of a parody of divine glossolalia. Instead, in Inferno, language is confused and distorted and warped, whereas in heaven, it is mingled to become something purer and more beautiful. So he blends both Hebrew and Latin to say, Hosanna, holy God of hosts, who by thy brightness dost illuminate from above the happy fires of these realms. There's still those political overtones, the way that God is working through the Roman Empire, as we saw in the last canto, but also that sense of duality here. And there's a continued duality after this, as light flows down from God and blends with Justinian's light. I saw that being in whom a double light is twinned, caught up in song, he and the others moving in their dance, and like the fastest flying sparks, veiled from me by their sudden distance. They soar up and away back to the Empyrean, where they're going to float around God. That duality, that doubleness of the light, the doubleness of the languages reminds us again of that sort of double idea of earthly empire and heavenly citizenship. The two should function in conjunction. Conjunction function, that's terrible. And as we see Dante doing so often, he pauses with a question to ask Beatrice. And there's a little bit of playfulness in the way he's so awed by Beatrice that he doesn't know how to phrase the question. He can't even begin to say her name. And so Beatrice does, as she does so often, through Paradiso, and answers the question for him without him even asking. It's actually going to give him a 3-point theological lecture here. Each point addressing a question he had over Justinian, or a question he has over her further commentary on Justinian's words. So get ready for the heavy theology. The first problem that Dante faces here is the idea of justice. There was a lot about justice in Justinian's conversation. And here's the problem. Jesus' death was just, as I mentioned in the last video, because it was part of God's plan. And yet, the punishment on those who crucified Jesus was also just. How could Jesus' crucifixion be just and yet be punished at the same time? Justice was done through the cross, according to Beatrice, because what Christ was doing was paying for the sin of the world. And yet it was also injustice because in his purity, he didn't deserve that punishment. If then the penalty exacted by the cross is measured by the nature he assumed, no other ever stung so justly. Yet it is also true that there was never done so great an outrage with regard to him who suffered, having taken on that nature. She first establishes that humanity is sinful, and so Christ, taking on that nature, pays the price for humanity, being a representative of humanity by choice. From a single act, then, came diverse effects, for the same death delighted God as well as Jews, because it earth quaked and heaven opened. There's a double effect here to Christ's death. It was something that brought about justice, rectifying God to man, but also it was an action that was unjust because it was done to a perfect person. It made God happy because it was part of his perfect plan, but it also made the Jews who crucified him happy because they were getting vengeance on him. And so when they were punished through the destruction of Jerusalem, according to Beatrice, it was also justice for their action. Again, what they were willing was wrong, and yet the outcome was right. If you thought that was heavy, wait till you get to the next theological point. She moves on in line 52 to a more complicated problem, and that is, but why does Christ have to die at all? How is Christ's death appropriate and necessary to Christianity? Couldn't we fix it in some less intense way, maybe? And Beatrice says, okay, listen closely because this is complicated. In fact, the reason for this decree, brother, lies buried, hidden from the eyes of all whose minds have not been ripened in the flame of love. So unless you have been ripened in the flame of love, unless your love is truly pure, you're not going to get this point. Of course, Dante has been ripened in the flame of love, right? We've passed through those fires at the top of Mount Purgatory and understood what true love is about. And so here's her argument why Christ's crucifixion was the most fitting choice. It starts off with who humanity could have been before sin. We were immortal, living forever, we were good because we were made so, and we had free will, the will to choose. However, by choosing evil, Adam placed sin upon humanity. While we were good, it says in line 74, the holy ardor that irradiates all things shines brightest in what most resembles it. In all these gifts, the human creature is advantaged, but if a single gift is lacking, he must fall from his exalted state. Sin alone is what enslaves him, making him unlike the highest good, so that he is illumined by its light but little, never returning to his privilege unless he fills the void created by his fault with penalties fit for his sinful pleasure. So we were perfect and good, and in our perfect goodness, as created in the image of God, we shined God's light brightly through us. But by falling away from goodness, by sin, and using our free will inappropriately, we have fallen so far that we no longer shine God's light. The only way to return is to repay that debt. Humanity, in its entirety, has failed. Nor could they be recovered, line 88, if you consider closely, by any other recourse except to ford one of these crossings. Ready? There's two routes that we could take to fix this problem. Number one, we could pay the penalty ourselves, or God could just forgive us for it. Either that God in his own clemency had pardoned, or that man of himself had given satisfaction for his foolish pride. So either we've got to pay the debt, or God's just got to forgive us the debt, one or the other. However, humanity couldn't ever pay it, because no matter what good we do now, whatever obedience we do now, it will never make up for the mistake that we've made in the past. Man could never offer satisfaction, for he could not descend as deep into humility by latter-day obedience as by disobeying he had thought to rise. So, the only choice left is for God to pardon us. But here's the kicker. But since the deed more gratifies the doer, the more it shows the goodness of the heart from which it springs, divine goodness, which puts its imprint on the world, was pleased to proceed in both ways to raise you up again. In other words, God decided to not just pardon humanity, but to extend his goodness in both directions. Become human to achieve the sacrifice, while at the same time forgiving from above. So God is both pardoning and paying at the same time. Double goodness. Double awesome. All other means fell short of justice, save that the Son of God should humble himself by becoming flesh. And finally we come to our third point, which is about corruptibility, incorruptibility, and things that last. So, Dante wonders, in the midst of all this, if God made the universe, then why isn't the universe eternal? God made me, I'm eternal, I'm immortal, my soul is eternal. God made the universe, why aren't dogs eternal? Why aren't trees eternal? These things were created so that if what was said is true, they should be proof against corruption, right? And Beatrice responds to this by saying, those elements that have been named and those other things made from them take their form from creative power. Created was the matter that is in them, created the informing power in these stars that wheel about them. The soul of every beast and every plant is drawn from a complex of potentials by the shining and motion of the holy lights. Yes, all that stuff comes from creation, and yet humanity is different and special and more eternal than all of that. It comes from creation, but with a complexity of potentials. But supreme goodness breathes life in you, unmediated, and he so enamors your soul of himself that it desires him forever after. So it's the breath of God entering into humanity that enamors it with God and ultimately draws the human soul back to God, unlike every other created thing. Everything else in creation is a distillation, I guess, of what was created. But humanity has that unmediated breath of God. Ooh, theology! Paradiso is heavy stuff. Lots of heavy theology going on here. We were getting heavy politically last time, now we're getting heavy theologically. Let's continue on to Venus next time as we look at Canto 8. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again later. Bye-bye.